believe it's Wednesday, April 6th. I'm like, I'm still getting used to writing 2022 instead of 2021. And it's already like 4 months into the 2022 already. I'm like, can it go any faster, right? Seems like it speeds up every year. Remember when you were a little kid and you had Christmas and it seemed like 10 centuries before Christmas came around again? Now it's like, hey, it's Christmas again, you know? No, it was yesterday. No, it's the next year already. So, again, God chronicles the lives of the Israelites here in Chronicles. A little visit here this morning, or this evening, I should say. Again, God dispels all doubts, and I kind of brought that back into memory because you see the account of Saul, and I think it's in 9 or it's in 10, which we'll get there in a little bit. That's in 10. I won't get there, but a little verse of that. But how Saul died on Mount Gebo, I think it was. When I've been framing all day, my brain kind of wanders. Mount Gilboa. So there was a little bit of a I could say debate about what happened up on the mountain because the Amalekites supposedly killed Saul, and then some other guy came and said that he did it, and David killed both of them for even saying they did it. But I think God gives the truthful account of actually what happened is Saul ended up falling on his own sword there, committed suicide, I think. Anyway, but yeah, I think God just kind of has this because most importantly, it's a spiritual account of how the record that's kept in heaven. This is what matters. The other part is open to interpretation of earthly people and various things when you look at 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and all that, and then you have 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles going over the same stories, but I think it's God writing down the final story, the final say of the matter there. So chapter 5, as Ezra again is writing, so when they come back to Israel after being in Babylon for that 70-year period, and some longer, stayed longer, but he gives an account so they know who they are and they know where their tribal allotments are still, and they know their duties, especially if they're Levites and various things. So it's all recorded there, so they're not forgotten. And you see things, again, that you don't see in the other books. So chapter 5, verse 1, the genealogy of Reuben, or the descendants of Reuben, I should say, rather than the genealogy. It's more of the heritage of who they were, so they would know. And it's interesting today is like most Jews don't really know what tribe they're from. If they do, I'm impressed that you can keep track of that. Paul knew at the time of Christ, but again, that's been a long time back now. But they probably don't really know what tribe they're from. Some might think they do, but I would have to kind of wonder about that. If they had some source of record or whatever, that'd be great. But when you read the book of Revelation, you find out that God knows exactly what tribe they're from, and he will in some way reveal to them what tribe they're from, and they'll know who they are. But here we have the account that this is what Ezra was trying to do, so they would know when they went back into the land of Israel. So chapter 5, verse 1, the oldest son of Israel was Reuben. But since he dishonored his father by sleeping with one of his father's concubines, his birthright was given to the sons of his brother Joseph. I was always wondering how Joseph ended up being one of the, his two sons being added into the tribal count, because you get into some different numbers there, 13, 12, and you go, which is it, 12 or 13? And so the two sons are taking Reuben's place. For this reason, Reuben is not listed in the genealogical records as the firstborn son. The descendants of Judah became the most powerful tribe and provided a ruler for the nation, but the birthright belonged to Joseph right there. So you see a little thing with Reuben here that happens, and it caught my attention because losing your firstborn status is no small thing. You don't want to lose that firstborn status. Okay, do we have that today? I don't know where Scott falls in the birth line of his family, brothers, sisters, whatever. I am the last born in our family, right? And it doesn't really matter too much for us in that sense, but it matters in this. I don't ever want to lose my born again status with the Lord. And it's kind of the same thing. This is like something that was important to God and for them, because he was going to be the one that was going to pass on that tribal line to the next firstborn. And it's a spiritual thing, really, is what it is. And we know it because we look at Esau. Remember, he was like the champion of giving away his firstborn status with his brother Jacob. Remember, Jacob gave him the bowl of red soup or stew or whatever it was. And Esau just, oh, yeah, you can have it. Firstborn, schmirschborn. I don't care. I'm hungry. Give me some of that stew. And we read the book of Hebrews, and he was actually considered profane in his life. He just didn't take it as a spiritual matter like it is. And so Reuben, too, it was taken from him by his dad for doing what he did. I'm like, Reuben just blows my mind. Basically, sin has consequences, right? And again, losing that status is no small thing. I mean, the guy slept with his stepmother, basically. I can't remember which one of Jacob's wives it was. It was one of the concubine wives. I can't remember. There's Bilhah and Milcah, and I get them mixed up. But he did that after Rachel died, which is, again, made it worse. Here's Jacob suffering because his wife died, and then that happened after that. I'm like, what was in this guy's head, right? Temptation given into is very destructive. And we find here in the book of Chronicles that this is the end of the story is like he's not listed in the genealogical records anymore, and he's as the firstborn son. He's still the tribe of Reuben, but his status has been given to Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Okay, so 25, jumping over there, chapter 5, verse 25. And I'm showing these things because we're going to get to see the faithfulness of God versus sometimes the unfaithfulness of men. And I was just blown away by how faithful God is no matter what. And again, this is his record. Verse 25, but these tribes were unfaithful to the God of their ancestors. They worshiped the gods of the nations that God had destroyed. So the God of Israel caused King Pul of Assyria, also known as Tiglath-Pileser, to invade the land, take away the people of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh as captives. The Assyrians exiled them to Halah, Habor, Hara, and Gozan, and the Gozan River, where they remain to this day. So he jumps over from Reuben to the tribes that were on the east side of the Jordan, which, again, I wish they would have never stayed over there, Reuben included. And it's interesting here that we see this. God so blessed them over there because it was such a fertile area, and they saw it, and they had so much livestock they wanted to stay there. But honestly, I think God would have blessed them more if they'd have been on the west side of the Jordan where they were supposed to be. But God so blessed them, and they lost it all. For what reason? It tells us right there. They were unfaithful to the God of their ancestors, to God. They were unfaithful, and God saw it, takes note of it. And it just reminded me, our God is a jealous God. Do you guys remember that? When the first time that God gave the commandments in the book of Exodus, he also gives them in Deuteronomy too. But in the book of Exodus, God reminds them, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself no graven images. And then God says, for I'm a jealous God. He's not jealous of us. He's jealous for us. He's jealous in a very healthy, good way. Versus when we get jealous, it's usually like, because we want that, and it's bad jealousy, right? God is so good even in his jealousy. And when he says, I don't want you worshiping other gods, it's because he knows they're not good for you. And there is no other gods out there to begin with. And if you're worshiping some other god, it's a product of Satan's doing and working. And so they got sucked into that, and God noticed, you know what? I couldn't take the unfaithfulness anymore, and they got taken away by King Pul or Tiglath-Pileser, and they got dispersed out throughout the lands. And so again, God is very adamant about us knowing that he's the only one true living God. That's something we don't want to forget. I was up there, staying up in Logan, and I was watching public television, which was kind of an interesting program because it was talking about church architecture. And I'm like, this is pretty good TV, man. And I'm watching it, and they're showing all these churches and the reasons they were built the way they were built, from the steeples back in the 1800s and all these stained glass era things and all that. But I started realizing that they were including every form of religion in that. Why the church was built that way for the Muslims or the Catholics or the Protestants, and on down the line. And I'm like, these people I could tell these people aren't saved, because they're just thinking it's like just church is church for whatever God you worship. I'm like, that's actually absolutely unbiblical definition of what church is, And I think one guy finally said that the church was not the building itself, that it was the people that were going in there. I'm like, at least he's on the right track, right? But they showed this church in Colorado. I think it's Colorado Springs, the Air Force up there, that has this amazing chapel, and it looks like airplanes going up into heaven is what they designed it as. But then the guy says they got this section for the Muslims, this section for the Catholics, this section for the Protestants. And I'm like, that's not a church, man. That's a multi-purpose center for whoever wants to go there, So God is one. He's not multiple choice. And that's what you see there in 25 through 6 there of chapter 5. We got to be faithful to the Lord. And he is faithful to us, so faithful. So moving over to chapter 9. Again, just interesting information you find here that God put in the Chronicles that answers a lot of questions sometimes. Oh, where did the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh get their status? There it was right there. Why did they get taken away by Tiglath-Pileser for their unfaithfulness? There it is right there. And so in just in case you haven't answered in your mind, especially because we're going through Ezekiel on Sunday morning, right? Why they were taken to Babylon, the southern tribes of Judah, and I guess it would be Benjamin too. Why were they taken to Babylon, as well as why was the northern tribes taken to Syria? Here it is right here, chapter 9, 1 through 3. So all Israel was listed in the genealogical records in the book of the kings of Israel. The people of Judah were exiled to Babylon because they were unfaithful to the Lord. I'm like, that's about as straightforward as it gets, right? So simple. We now know any doubts that arise. Well, no, it was for idolatry. Okay, well, that's unfaithfulness. It was for murder and bloodshed. Well, that's unfaithfulness. All the way down the line. It's just straightforward. God just says they were unfaithful to the Lord. Verse 2, the first of the exiles to return to their property in their former towns were priests, Levites, temple servants, and other Israelites. Some of the people from the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh came and settled in Jerusalem. Okay, and that also answers the question, did they actually go back to their property? Right there it tells us some of them did. Some of them were able to find it and go back to it and live there once again. Okay, and so it just reminds me, God is so faithful. Right, verse 2. They were able to go back. The period that God that actually let them go back in the first place is his faithfulness. And he said all along he was going to bring them back. He's so faithful, and he remains faithful forever. You guys know in the book of Philippians, I think it's in chapter 2 or so, where it says, it might not be in Philippians, but the passage is in my mind right now where God says he's faithful. He cannot deny himself. If we deny him, then we're faithless. But if he's always faithful, he cannot deny himself. All right, and here he is right here, bringing them back to their own land again. That just speaks again of God's faithfulness, even when they were unfaithful. And I'm thankful for that, because sometimes we're unfaithful. Maybe not in a huge idolatrous way, doing something like that, but sometimes we're unfaithful in little things, but God remains faithful. I'm so thankful for that. So jumping down to 22, and this is the part that I really enjoyed, and we'll spend a little more time here. Those are just indicators, because I'm going to use them as bookends versus what God is. So in 22, now he's talking about the Levites right here, and I find it's interesting that David is involved. Verse 22 of chapter 9. Yes, ma'am. So David involved with this work of the ministry that is being brought back into play because they're going back to the land. Okay, so in all, speaking of all the Levites that were returning in verses 14 through 20, in all, there were 212 gatekeepers in those days, and they were listed according to the genealogies in their villages. Check this out. David and Samuel the seer had appointed their ancestors because they were reliable men. The gatekeepers and their descendants by their divisions were responsible for guarding the entrance to the house of the Lord when that house was a tent. The gatekeepers were stationed on all four sides, east, west, north, and south, and their relatives in the villages came regularly to share their duties for 7-day periods. Okay, and 1 through 4 there, or I'm sorry, 22 through 24 there, or actually 25. Okay, first thing we see, the Levites were the first to come back and start getting things set in place. And I thought, that's just like the Lord. Before anyone really got there and started moving in, God already had worship in place. God already had prayer in place. And he already had the place for them to do their sacrifices and come visit with the Lord. Okay, God wanted that in place first. And I thought that was very good too. And then I had this little insight in 22. David was involved with Samuel with these gatekeepers. And I'm like, when did that happen? You guys remember David, when he knew Samuel, he was very young, right? And then, I don't know, Samuel didn't live very long after David was anointed king. And then Saul started chasing David around the countryside for 13 years. I think Samuel died in that period. So when did David and Samuel get together and decide to do this, the appointing of gatekeepers? And it just must have been one of those times when him and David and Samuel were at the little tabernacle and just worshiping and praising the Lord. And Samuel, knowing he was going to be king, they must have just done this. That first time I remember reading it right here, and I've read Chronicles probably 30 times, right? And so they probably made this decision somewhere along that line. Pretty neat. Now, gatekeeping. That doesn't sound like a glamorous job, I hope. Do you guys think that's a glamorous job? Well, I'm a gatekeeper. I'm going to open and shut, and I'm going to keep this guy out and let this guy in. And there's more to it, as I'll read in a minute here, but I don't think it's glamorous work at all. You know, and then you think, well, what are they guarding? It's the church, right? It's the tabernacle. It's God's tabernacle. But remember what's in there, you guys. Tons and tons of gold go into that. There's a lot that went into the temple that Solomon built, but the tabernacle here, even this had tons and tons of gold in it, and silver and bronze and costly things were in there. And not to mention that certain people weren't allowed in there. Only priests were supposed to go in there at certain times and various things. And do you think anyone's dumb enough to go in there and try and go in there? I hope you do, because we just read what Reuben did in his dumbness, right? And what the whole clan did in their dumbness on the east side of the Jordan. So there's probably someone, for some weird concocted reason in his mind, would try and go in there. And again, you didn't go in there because you'd probably get struck down by the Lord, because you weren't supposed to be in there. And so the guards were actually doing you a favor to keep you out. And so again, interesting concept with the gatekeeping. And they did it for 7-day periods too. So they would be on duty for that whole week, you know. And just how important this is you guys remember Psalm 84:10? Anyone have that in their memory bank? I don't know the address until I looked it up, but I know the quote. You guys remember this? Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. And then David says, I'd rather be a gatekeeper in the house of my Lord than take any kind of fellowship with the wicked. David is saying, man, I'd be a gatekeeper at God's house any day of the week, as long as I wasn't over hanging out with evil people instead. This is probably, again, him recounting when they were there sometime in the tabernacle, and he was hanging out with Samuel, and they came up with the whole concept and everything. But again, David likes to be in God's service 7 days a week, 365, whatever you want to say, 24/7, 365. He would rather do that than anything else. And again, I can't think of a place I'd rather go than hang out with God too. And so again, we got through 25, and then 26 and 27 on it tells us again what they were doing and what they were guarding. So verse 26, the 4 chief gatekeepers, all Levites, were trusted officials, for they were responsible for the rooms and treasuries at the house of God. So the things that were kept there too. 27, they would spend the night around the house of God, since it was their duty to guard it and open the gates every morning. They'd stay the night. That's pretty cool. 28, some of the gatekeepers were assigned to care for various articles used in worship, like the menorah, right? The solid gold menorah. I think that thing had like 75 talents of gold. It was in there. They checked them in and out to avoid any loss. Others were responsible for furnishings, the items in the sanctuary, and the supplies such as choice flour, wine, olive oil, frankincense, and spices. But it was the priest who blended the spices. Mattithiah, a Levite and the oldest son of Shallum the Korathite, was entrusted with baking the bread used in the offering, and some members of the clan of Kohath were in charge of preparing the bread to be set on the table each Sabbath day. Verse 33, the musicians, all prominent Levites, lived at the temple. Remember Samuel did that when he was little? They were exempt from other responsibilities since they were on duty at all hours. All these men lived in Jerusalem. They were the heads of the Levite families and were listed as prominent leaders in their genealogical records. Okay, so this is again when they got back to the land of Israel in Jerusalem specifically. Okay, tells us again what they were doing there and what they were guarding. 29, they were baking bread. Can you guys just kind of close your eyes right now and just smell fresh baked bread out of the oven? Unless you've never baked it, then you might not know, but you should try it. Or go to a bakery somewhere and stick your head in the door and smell it, right? And then you put that hot butter on it, and so good. Well, they served that to God every Sabbath, and then it would stay in there all week until they would take it back out. Remember, David actually got some of that bread one time for him and his amigos when they were hungry, right? So those guys did that. Isn't that wonderful to serve God in that way? And then the incense and the spices that they made, that you were not supposed to try and make it on your own and use it for your own purpose. And the law says under the penalty of death, don't do that. Well, these were the guys that were in charge of making sure that was done for them, for the priestly service and them only. Interestingly enough, I heard a pastor on Grace Radio, and so he's a Calvary guy, and I don't necessarily disagree with him, but I thought it was kind of interesting. He was reading from Chronicles, and he was talking about that oil that they would use, the anointing oil and the incense oil and all that stuff. And he mentioned, yeah, it's penalty of death. You weren't supposed to reproduce that and use that for your own personal use, right? And then he said, I don't think God would kill you if you made it today. And I thought, I'm not going to try and find that out.
Somebody did that because it gives the proportions. Am I remembering right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're not under the law, and maybe God wouldn't, but I'm not going to try and find out. That's all I know. Somebody probably has. And the recipe's in the Bible. How exactly they did it, it's different. But I just thought that was kind of neat that he thought that God would be okay with you making that stuff now. I'm like, I ain't going to find out because I don't want to. I love the law and I obey the law as far as the practical things go. I'm not going to go offer a goat for a sacrifice, but I'm not going to be making none of that smelly good stuff either. So they did that. And then in 33, the guys in 32 were in charge of setting the bread out each time. And then 33, the musicians, all prominent Levites, lived at the temple. And it tells us that they were basically worshiping the Lord at any time, any hour of the day, all hours of the day. And there's a passage for that somewhere else, that the worship of the Lord was going on all the time in the temple, which is really cool. And so they were probably involved in a 24-hour, round-the-clock worship was always happening. Somebody would probably just be playing to the Lord. And we know that David knew how to do that, because he would do that for Saul to try and calm Saul down. And so again, his influence is probably part of it. And so they went back to Jerusalem in 34. And it just reminded me how faithful God is. God does not owe us anything, right? He's just acting on his own word. And he said that one day they would come back and that he would bless them. And some of the blessings and things that he's going to do are still to come, which is amazing. When you look at the two bookends that happen, and here's God's faithfulness above that whole thing, because in chapter 10, verse 13, it says this. And again, I was talking about the account of how Saul died. It talks about it right there, and I won't read the whole thing because we don't have time. But in verse 13, it tells us why he died. And this is, again, God's chronological spiritual record. Saul, in chapter 10, verse 13, so Saul died because he was unfaithful to the Lord. He failed to obey the Lord's command, and he even consulted a medium. He didn't like to do what God told him to do. And even when God just said, I'm not even going to talk to you anymore, then he tried to get around it and to get into the other spiritual realm, which is a bad thing to do, and that did not make God happy. And remember, Samuel was like, why'd you call me up, man? Remember that? It's like, I'm over here hanging out on a hammock, man, and enjoying the view, and you called me up? And the Lord probably told Samuel, you got to go talk to that guy. I don't really want you to, but you kind of need to. Anyway, just trying to imagine it in my mind on that side of eternity, right? No clue what it's going to be like until we get there. But verse 14, instead of asking the Lord for guidance, when God, if he would have been faithful, God wouldn't have ever stopped talking to him, and God would have given him whatever he needed, but it was his unfaithfulness. And so the Lord killed him. That's really who killed him. Saul could have fell on his own sword and all that in the earlier part of the chapter 10 here, but really God says, I took care of him. And the Lord killed him, and he turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. And so again, what do you see in men? You see unfaithfulness, and then you see God in the middle, always faithful. Or in the end, he's faithful, or whatever, however you want to slice it. And I just thought as I was reading through these chapters, and I got to this point right here, and I'm like, man, the men have been unfaithful, and God's been faithful. Even to David, God's faithful to his word. What he told David was going to happen, you're going to be the king. That happened. You guys are going to come back, later when you go into idolatry and all that, and I bring you to Babylon and Assyria and all that. Well, I'm going to bring you back. He's faithful to that. He's always faithful to his word. He always will be. So that kind of blessed me as I was reading it yesterday and today. And of course, if you go on, you'll see that David becomes king, and God's even more faithful than ever. So forth. So I think you just take away from it, let's be faithful because God is faithful. And even when we aren't faithful, he's going to be faithful anyway, which is good. Okay, any takeaway, any thoughts? Don't make that perfumey incense either. Don't tempt God.
Yeah, 70 years in captivity, many of them wouldn't have known anything different. I guess if you, were sent into captivity when you were 10 or 15 years old, you might be back, But I think Daniel, didn't he live into his 90s? Or they don't say
He did.
specifically, but
He probably could have went back, but he just didn't because he had such important things that he was doing there, and God probably just told him that he would stay there. We know in the book of Daniel, God tells him you're gonna die in I can't remember how it's worded, like ripe age and in goodness and things like that. So he died with favor of the Babylonians even at that point. I think he was like 90 when he went to see Belteshazzar, the writing on the wall.
yeah.
He was way up there at that point. Yeah, and they put a gold chain around his neck. So he was like he had bling when he was like 90. I always thought, like, if I ever go to Israel, I'd be kicking around in the sand and found a gold chain, that ancient, artifact in the sand or something, That'd be cool.
Yeah, I wonder, like with Daniel, they were saying, we're reading it now, but apparently they would pick some young kids with potential
Mhm.
and make them eunuchs and then send them to the school of sages where they could,
Mhm.
learn all the wise stuff. And it's, I guess they must have had some sort of a ASVAB test or something. Because they didn't do that
Maybe.
to everybody, but they picked certain ones.
That was mainly royalty,
Yeah.
and if they didn't pass when they got there, they just, you flunk, sorry. You go with the rest of the Hebrew slaves,
Yeah.
But they actually excelled, didn't they?
Yeah. And you
Alright.
have 3 friends too that
Mm-hmm.
aren't mentioned as much, but
It's funny how we always know their Babylonian names, but we can't. It's harder to remember their Hebrew names. And I know them if I work hard on it. But
Shadrach and Meshach.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those are the names that the king of Babylon gave them. They actually had Hebrew names: Azariah,
Right.
Hananiah, I think.
Yeah, Hananiah was one.
Yeah, and then Mishael, I think. All those names mean something about the Lord, and then he gave them all names that meant something about the god of Babylon at that time. Yeah. But God used them because Nebuchadnezzar got saved. It's pretty cool. All right, well, let's pray. So, Father, thank you again for your word tonight. Thank you for your faithfulness, even in the midst of men that were unfaithful. Even sometimes in our faithfulness, you still stay faithful to us. Philippians tells us, Lord. Thank you for Samuel and David, that not everyone was like that, and they had their failures too, but they were faithful, Lord. And Daniel was faithful, and his 3 friends were faithful. And I'm sure Ezra and many others were also faithful, Nehemiah and the ones that we know about, Lord, that wrote the books. But I'm sure many others too, Lord. So you're good in the end, and that's what we need to remember. And thank you for the record, Lord. You chronicle our life. You're keeping a chronological record of our life, the spiritual one that really matters. And we have to remember, Lord, in Chronicles, you actually leave a lot of things out that we want left out, which is really cool. Like when you left out David's sin with Bathsheba when you chronicled that in the Chronicles. And I'm like, wow, that's forgiveness and grace right there. And so, Lord, thank you for leaving things out and just writing down what we should be doing in your faithfulness, Lord, because you do that. And you know who's yours, and you see it in the end here. It's amazing. So kind of makes us wonder about when they're listed as unfaithful. We wonder, whoa. And Lord, we don't want to wonder. We want to know for sure where we're going and who our God is and that we're saved. We have a place in eternity in heaven, Lord, and we're in the Lamb's book of life. And Lord, you're faithful to keep us in there if we remain and abide in you. So we want to do that, Lord. Help us do that this week and next week and the next week after that and so forth. So, Lord, thank you for tonight. In Jesus' name, amen.